how many fell prey to Holmes' house of horrors will never truly be known.
My understanding is that he had the ability within his hotel to put a number of individuals in the same room and then deprive them of oxygen, and he was able to listen to them as they died. Now that's a step away from, say, the enjoyment of killing someone face to face, right? In other words, he wasn't stabbing them, he wasn't doing any of that. He was listening to them experience death. That came later. You know, his initial forays into crime, money-making schemes, con schemes, obviously predated the murder, but once he'd killed a few times, he apparently developed a taste for it. That hotel, while it was to a certain degree a money-making thing, I mean, he ran it as a hotel, there were people that checked in, he obviously got money from them, but there was a lot of money spent on pursuing his fantasy or his murder life, if you will. It's pretty interesting that he would use another kind of criminal behavior to essentially fund a non-profit making aspect of his criminal behavior, which was killing people for fun.
Holmes might never have been caught, except for his own greed. When the Chicago Fair closed in October of 1893, Holmes decided to leave the Windy City. But before he left, he teamed up with two other con men, Benjamin Pitezel and Marion Hedgepeth, for one more scam, this time in Philadelphia. The three of them agreed to fake Pitezel's death in a laboratory explosion and substitute a cadaver. They would then split the $10,000 life insurance policy on Pitezel 3 ways. But Holmes' greed led him to kill Pitezel for real. Then Holmes reneged on Hedgepeth's share and ran off with the money and 3 of Pitezel's 5 children, Howard, Alice, and Nellie Pitezel. Incensed that he hadn't gotten his share, Marion Hedgepeth ratted him out. Holmes was eventually tracked down by Philadelphia detective Frank Geyer in 1894. Geyer was the first of the serial killer detectives. Detectives who, through sheer determination and dogged police work, would bring these hell fiends to justice. Sadly, Geyer was too late to save the children. Holmes had already murdered them. The Philadelphia prosecutors tried and convicted Holmes for Benjamin Pitezel's murder and the brutal killing of the 3 children. But the full depth of Holmes' depravity lay back in Chicago. There, police, alerted by the insurance underwriter for the Pitezel claim, raided Holmes' murder castle. What they found turned the stomachs of even the most hardened of Chicago's cops. Strong men who had lived through the Chicago fire that killed thousands. The mansion contained rooms for torture and gas chambers. The stove in his office held a rib bone and hair of a woman. But the real horror was in the basement. Here, police uncovered a macabre disassembly plant for human bodies. It was here that Holmes dissected his victims, stripped the flesh with powerful acids, and then sold their skeletons to medical schools across the country. Those he didn't dissect were burned in 2 furnaces that he had specially constructed for that purpose. Or they were cast into lime pits. The total number of victims will never be known. But evidence pointed to hundreds murdered. Confronted by the proof of his horrific crimes, Holmes admitted to hundreds of killings while in Chicago. He described his acts of murder methodically, without conscience, the way a man would describe butchering cattle. Indeed, throughout his confession, Holmes, America's first and most accomplished serial killer, sat stone-faced as he recited ghoulish details of the slaughter. Indeed, as many future serial killers would do when they were caught.
There's a couple things that I find really most interesting about Holmes. Number one is that he was a criminal in the larger sense. In other words, a lot of his murders were associated with insurance scams. He was a guy who was after the buck. But somewhere along the way, associated with his, what we would call more typical or normal criminal activity, he came to be fascinated with death, and he pursued that to a degree of elaboration that I can't say we can attribute to any other serial killer. He built a castle, essentially, a hotel, which was devoted from the beginning, prior to construction, to the killing of human beings and to his ability to enjoy and experience in many different ways the killing of human beings. That's unique. This wasn't just a person who killed once or twice or even a number of times. This is a person who built up an elaborate physical building that sole purpose was to allow him to kill people in the most elaborate ways, to listen to their cries of pain, and then to dispose of the bodies so that he wouldn't be caught. The elaboration of that fantasy required as its first step a lack of conscience.
For Holmes, killing was part of his compulsive crime business. But it was also a business for which he had no scruples. A business for which he had no conscience, showed no remorse. H. Holmes was put to death in 1896 by hanging. It took him 15 minutes to strangle to death, shorter than many of the tortures his victims endured in his house of horrors. As for Chicago's Castle of Death with its grisly evidence of murder, it burned to the ground in 1895, but was forever embedded in the American popular culture as the archetypal house of death and torture.